I am Quincy, 65 years old, a retired architect from Boston. The lakeside villa I designed and built over 20 years ago was my pride and joy until my son Jeffrey married Alicia 3 years back. Everything changed after their wedding. Last month, during dinner, Jeffrey announced that my villa now belonged to his wife's family. He looked me straight in the eyes and said, "This is theirs now. You are not allowed to come." I simply smiled and nodded. If you are curious about what happened next, let me know where you are watching from. Hit that like button and subscribe to follow my journey of betrayal, heartbreak, and sweet justice. I grew up in a working-class neighborhood in South Boston. My father worked at the shipyard, and my mother was a seamstress who took in extra work to help make ends meet. We lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment, with my 2 brothers and I sharing one room. Despite our modest means, my parents instilled in me the values of hard work, integrity, and the importance of family. From an early age, I showed an interest in buildings and structures. I would spend hours drawing houses and sketching floor plans. My parents noticed this passion and encouraged it, even when money was tight. My father would bring home discarded blueprints from construction sites near the shipyard, and I would study them intensely. Through scholarships and working multiple jobs, I managed to put myself through architecture school at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Those years were challenging but fulfilling. I learned not just about design principles and structural engineering, but also about perseverance and self-reliance. After graduation, I started at a small architecture firm in Boston, working my way up through determination and innovative designs. By my late 30s, I had established a reputation for creating homes that were both aesthetically pleasing and functionally superior. My specialty became luxury waterfront properties, though ironically, I still rented a modest apartment myself. When I was 40, I met Marlene at a client's housewarming party. She was a kindergarten teacher with a warm smile and a kind heart. We married a year later, and our son Jeffrey was born the following year. Marlene and I purchased a comfortable house in a good school district, but I always dreamed of designing and building our perfect home one day. As my career flourished, I began searching for the ideal location for my masterpiece. After 5 years of looking, I found it a pristine plot of land on Lake Winnipesaukee in New Hampshire. The property featured 700 feet of private shoreline, majestic pine trees, and breathtaking sunset views across the water. The moment I stood on that land, I knew this was where I would build the home that would be my legacy. The design process took over a year. I poured every bit of knowledge and experience I had accumulated into creating a home that would be both a showcase of architectural excellence and a warm, comfortable place for our family. The villa would feature 4 bedrooms, each with its own bathroom, a grand living room with 20-foot ceilings and wall-to-wall windows facing the lake, a chef's kitchen, and a library. Outside, there would be a private dock, an infinity pool that seemed to merge with the lake, and gardens filled with native plants. Construction began when Jeffrey was 12. I remember how excited he was, visiting the site every weekend, watching as the foundation was laid and the frame went up. I taught him about load-bearing walls and the importance of southern exposure. He seemed genuinely interested, and I harbored hopes that he might follow in my footsteps one day. The villa took 5 years to complete. I was meticulous about every detail, from the hand-carved banister on the spiral staircase to the custom-built shelving in the library. I used only the finest materials, sustainable hardwoods, natural stone, and energy-efficient systems that were ahead of their time. The custom woodwork throughout the house became my personal signature. Every door frame, crown molding, and cabinet was crafted by artisans I had worked with for years. We moved in when Jeffrey was 17, just before he left for college at Princeton. Marlene and I finally had our dream home, and those first years were some of the happiest of our lives. We would host small gatherings for friends and colleagues, take long walks along our private beach, and fall asleep to the gentle sounds of waves lapping against the shore. The villa became even more precious to me after Marlene was diagnosed with breast cancer when Jeffrey was in his second year of college. She fought bravely for 3 years, and the villa became our sanctuary. I designed a sunny garden room where she could rest comfortably while enjoying views of the water. The master bedroom was reconfigured to accommodate hospital equipment while still maintaining its warmth and beauty. When she passed away, I scattered some of her ashes in her favorite spot in the garden, making the property not just a house but a sacred space that held her memory. After Marlene's death, the villa became my solace. Jeffrey had graduated by then and taken a job at a prestigious financial firm in New York City. I was immensely proud of him. I had paid for his education in full, wanting him to start his professional life without the burden of student loans. He would visit once a month or so, and we would spend quiet weekends fishing from the dock or grilling on the stone patio. I continued my architectural practice, but began to scale back, taking on fewer projects and focusing on those that truly inspired me. By 60, I had officially retired, though I still consulted occasionally on special projects. The villa was fully paid for, and I had accumulated enough savings and investments to live comfortably for the rest of my life. I had created not just a beautiful home, but financial security that I intended to pass on to Jeffrey one day. It was at a charity gala in Boston that Jeffrey met Alicia. He had brought me as his guest, saying he wanted to spend more time with me. The event was raising funds for cancer research, a cause close to my heart since losing Marlene. Jeffrey introduced me to Alicia early in the evening, a striking woman with perfect posture and a dazzling smile. She worked in art acquisitions for a major museum, and her knowledge of architecture impressed me initially. She asked thoughtful questions about my work, and seemed genuinely interested in my responses. Looking back, I should have noticed how her gaze constantly surveyed the room, assessing who was who, where the influential people were gathered. But I was just happy to see Jeffrey so enamored. He looked at her with the kind of admiration I had once looked at Marlene, and I wanted that happiness for my son. When Jeffrey called 3 months later to tell me they were getting serious, I was supportive. When he brought her to the villa for a weekend, I went all out to make her feel welcome, preparing Marlene's special recipes and giving them the master suite while I took the guest room. If only I had known then what that first visit would set in motion, perhaps I could have protected myself from what was to come. Alicia's first visit to the villa seemed to go well on the surface. She complimented the location and the views, though I noticed her cataloging each room with an appraising eye. During dinner on the first night, she mentioned that the kitchen was charmingly rustic, though it had been completely updated with top-of-the-line appliances just 5 years earlier. When she suggested that the living room furniture was a bit dated, I was taken aback. Marlene and I had carefully selected each piece for comfort and quality. Jeffrey, who had always loved the villa just as it was, immediately agreed with her. "Dad's style is a little old school," he said with a laugh that felt unfamiliar. "Alicia has an amazing eye for design. You should see her apartment in New York." It was a small moment, but something shifted. For the first time, my son seemed to be seeing my home, my creation, through someone else's critical eyes. By Sunday evening when they left, Alicia had made at least a dozen suggestions for updating the villa, from replacing the hardwood floors with something more contemporary to repainting the kitchen cabinets that I had custom-made from maple harvested from the property itself. Jeffrey called less frequently after that first visit, and when he did, our conversations felt strained. He began to mention Alicia's family. Often her father Thomas was a hedge fund manager. Her mother Eleanor came from old money with family properties in the Hamptons and Martha's Vineyard. I sensed a subtle comparison being drawn between my achievements and their generational wealth. 6 months after they started dating, Jeffrey and Alicia announced their engagement. I was genuinely happy for my son and offered to host the wedding at the villa. Alicia quickly dismissed the idea, saying her parents had already arranged for the ceremony to take place at the Boston Harbor Hotel. The wedding planning revealed another troubling pattern. Jeffrey continuously deferred to Alicia's tastes and her family's wishes. When Jeffrey asked if I would contribute to the wedding costs, I agreed without hesitation, wanting to do my part as the father of the groom. What I hadn't expected was the astronomical budget, nearly $300,000 for a single day's celebration. Nevertheless, I wrote the check, representing nearly a tenth of my retirement savings. The wedding was an extravagant affair with 400 guests, though I only knew about 20 of them. I found myself seated at a table far from the main wedding party, despite being the father of the groom. When I gave my speech, it was scheduled at the very end of the night, when half the guests had already left or were too inebriated to listen. Jeffrey barely acknowledged me during the reception, busy entertaining Alicia's extensive family and their social connections. After the honeymoon, Jeffrey and Alicia moved into a luxury apartment in Boston that her parents had purchased for them as a wedding gift. Their visits to the villa became more frequent, but the dynamic had changed entirely. Alicia would arrive with fabric swatches and paint samples, discussing with Jeffrey how they could modernize the space. I tried to be accommodating, allowing them to redecorate the guest bedroom they used, though it pained me to see the careful design choices I had made being dismantled. During one such visit, Alicia brought her parents along without warning me in advance. Thomas and Eleanor Harrington arrived in a chauffeur-driven Range Rover, dressed as if they were attending a country club luncheon rather than a casual family visit. Eleanor immediately began comparing the villa unfavorably to their summer house in Newport. "It's quaint," she said with a thin smile. "So interesting to see these regional architectural styles." Thomas spent the afternoon pacing the property line, making calls on his cell phone and taking photos. When I asked what he was doing, he vaguely mentioned just admiring the land. Later, I overheard him telling Jeffrey that the property had significant development potential if it weren't encumbered by the existing structure. That evening, during dinner, the conversation repeatedly turned to other lakefront properties the Harringtons knew of or owned. "We just acquired the most divine little compound on Lake George," Eleanor said. 7 acres, with 3 separate guest houses. "You and your father should come visit sometime, Jeffrey." The way she said your father made it clear I was an afterthought, not a welcome guest. Jeffrey nodded enthusiastically, while Alicia detailed their renovation plans for the Lake George property. "We're gutting it completely," she said. "The previous owner had no vision." As these visits became more frequent, Jeffrey's behavior toward me grew increasingly dismissive. He would interrupt me mid-sentence, roll his eyes when I shared stories from his childhood, and contradict me on facts about our family history. "That's not how it happened, Dad," he would say, even about events where he hadn't been present or had been too young to remember clearly. The first major argument occurred 6 months after the wedding. I returned from a weekend visiting old colleagues in Boston to find that Alicia had completely redecorated the main living room without my knowledge or permission. The comfortable leather sofa where Marlene and I had spent countless evenings was gone, replaced by an angular monstrosity in white fabric. The handcrafted coffee table made by a local artisan had been swapped for a glass and chrome piece that looked like it belonged in a corporate office. Most distressingly, the family photos had been removed, including my favorite picture of Marlene holding newborn Jeffrey. "Where are my things?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level. "Oh, we put them in storage," Alicia replied casually. "This room needed a complete refresh. It was so dark and heavy before." "You should have asked me first," I said. "This is my home." Jeffrey stepped between us. "Dad, don't be dramatic. We're just helping update the place. That old furniture was falling apart." "That sofa was custom-made and only 10 years old," I replied. "And those were family photos you removed. They're just in boxes in the garage," Jeffrey said dismissively. "Besides, we're family too. We thought you'd appreciate the upgrade." The argument escalated, with Jeffrey eventually shouting that I was stuck in the past and unable to move forward. When I insisted they return my belongings to their original places, Alicia stormed out of the room, and Jeffrey followed her, leaving me standing alone in what felt like a stranger's living room. The next morning, they left without resolving the issue. I spent the day retrieving my photos from carelessly packed boxes and attempting to find where they had taken the furniture. Eventually, I discovered the sofa and tables had been donated to a local thrift store. I managed to buy back the sofa, but the coffee table was already sold. A small piece of my history with Marlene, gone forever. When I called Jeffrey to express my hurt, he was defensive. "Alicia was just trying to help. She has contacts with designers who can really bring this place into this century. You should be thanking her." I realized then that my son no longer saw the villa as my creation, my home. In his eyes, influenced by Alicia and her family, it had become an outdated property in need of their superior taste and vision. What I couldn't understand yet was how far they would go to take it from me entirely. The next phase of their plan began innocuously enough. Jeffrey called one evening, his voice uncharacteristically warm and concerned. "Dad, I need to ask a favor. Alicia's brother, Scott, is going through a rough divorce. He needs a place to stay for a few weeks while he sorts things out. Would it be okay if he used one of the guest rooms at the villa?" Despite my reservations after the redecorating incident, I agreed. Family helps family, and I wanted to show Jeffrey that I could be flexible and supportive. Scott arrived 3 days later with what seemed like an excessive amount of luggage for a temporary stay. From the beginning, Scott made himself entirely too comfortable. He treated the kitchen as if it were his personal restaurant, leaving messes for me to clean up. He invited friends over without asking, sometimes returning late at night with groups of people who would drink and be loud until the early morning hours. When I politely suggested he might be more considerate, he looked genuinely surprised. "Jeffrey said you were cool with us using the place," he said. "Besides, isn't this going to be their house eventually anyway?" That comment caught me off guard. I had always intended to leave the villa to Jeffrey in my will, but the way Scott phrased it suggested a more imminent transfer of ownership, a plan I knew nothing about. 2 weeks into Scott's temporary stay, Alicia's parents arrived unannounced with suitcases. "We thought we'd join Scott for the weekend," Eleanor said, brushing past me into the foyer. Jeffrey said it wouldn't be a problem. That weekend turned into a week, and the dynamic in my home shifted dramatically. Thomas spent hours on his phone in the library, conducting business calls as if it were his private office. Eleanor rearranged the kitchen to her liking without asking, discarding specialized cooking tools I'd collected over the years. When I mentioned that I had planned to cook a special dinner that evening using those very tools, she waved her hand dismissively. "I ordered catering," she said. "Your kitchen simply isn't equipped for proper entertaining." I found myself increasingly relegated to the periphery of my own home, eating meals at odd hours to avoid uncomfortable family dinners where I was either ignored or subtly criticized. I began spending more time in my workshop in the boathouse, the one space they hadn't yet invaded. One afternoon, I returned from grocery shopping to find a small group of people I didn't recognize touring the property with Thomas. They were taking measurements and photographs, making notes on tablets. When I approached them, Thomas intercepted me with a tight smile. "Just some friends interested in the architectural details," he explained vaguely. "Jeffrey mentioned you wouldn't mind." Later that evening, I overheard a conversation between Scott and Thomas on the deck. I hadn't intended to eavesdrop, but their voices carried through the open windows. "How much longer do you think the old man will hold out?" Scott asked. "Jeffrey says he's working on it," Thomas replied. "The place needs a lot of work to be marketable, but the location is prime. Once we get him to sign over the deed, we can start the real renovations." "What if he won't sell?" Scott asked. Thomas laughed. "Everyone has their price. Besides, where would he go? He's sunk everything into this place. Jeffrey says he doesn't have the resources to start over somewhere else." I felt physically ill hearing them discuss me, as if I were an obstacle to be removed, not a person with rights to his own home. Worse was the revelation that Jeffrey was apparently part of whatever scheme they were concocting. The next day, I confronted Jeffrey on the phone about the strangers on my property. His explanation was filled with half-truths and evasions. "They're just some investors interested in lakefront architecture, Dad. No big deal." "Your father-in-law called them buyers," I said. "Are you planning to sell my house without telling me?" "Don't be paranoid," Jeffrey snapped. "No one's selling anything. You're overreacting as usual." But the pattern continued. Over the next few weeks, more of Alicia's relatives appeared for visits. An aunt and uncle took over the third bedroom. 2 cousins set up camp in the finished basement. Each new arrival brought more possessions, more rearrangement of my space. I began finding my personal items moved or missing altogether. My books disappeared from shelves, replaced by decorative objects I'd never seen before. Family photos were relocated to less prominent positions, eventually finding their way into drawers and closets. My clothes were shifted to a smaller closet to make room for Alicia's extensive wardrobe, despite the fact that she and Jeffrey supposedly still lived in Boston. When I tried to reclaim my spaces, I was made to feel unreasonable. "We're just making room for everyone," Jeffrey would say. "Don't be selfish, Dad." One evening, I came home to find workers removing Marlene's garden room furniture. The space had been cleared out, the walls freshly painted a color I would never have chosen. "What's happening here?" I demanded. "Eleanor needed a proper sunroom," Alicia explained, not looking up from her phone. "That old wicker was falling apart anyway." "Those pieces were special to me," I said, my voice breaking slightly. "That room was designed for Marlene when she was ill." Alicia finally looked at me, her expression a mixture of impatience and false sympathy. "Jeffrey told me. But that was years ago, Quincy. You need to move forward. We're helping you update this place." I realized then that they weren't just redecorating. They were systematically erasing all traces of my life with Marlene, all evidence that this home had been our creation. They were preparing to claim it as their own. The situation reached a breaking point when I discovered that someone had been in my private office, going through my financial documents. Papers were out of order, file drawers left partially open. When I checked my computer, I found that someone had accessed my email account. That night, I installed a lock on my office door and changed all my passwords. The next morning, Jeffrey confronted me, angry that I had restricted access to part of the house. "We need to be able to get into every room," he insisted. "What if there's a maintenance issue while you're out?" "Then call me," I said firmly. "My private papers are not your concern." He stormed off, and later that day, I overheard him on the phone with someone, his voice low and tense. "He's being difficult," he said. "We may need to accelerate the timeline." I spent that night researching elder law and property rights, a sick feeling growing in my stomach as I realized that my son, the child I had raised, educated, and planned to make my heir, was actively working against me. The question was no longer if they would try to take my home, but when and how they would make their move. The pivotal moment came during what Jeffrey called a family dinner at the villa. He had insisted I be present, saying there were important matters to discuss. When I arrived at the dining room, I found it set for an elaborate meal. Thomas sat at the head of my table, with Eleanor at his right. Alicia, Jeffrey, Scott, and several other family members filled the remaining seats. I was directed to a chair at the far end, almost as an afterthought. The conversation during the first courses revolved around properties the Harrington family owned or had recently acquired. Thomas boasted about a commercial development in downtown Boston that had doubled their investment in just 3 years. Eleanor detailed renovations to their Hamptons estate, explaining how they had completely reimagined the outdated space. As dessert was served, Jeffrey stood up and tapped his glass with a spoon. The room fell silent as everyone turned to him with expectant smiles. Everyone except me, I felt a growing sense of dread. "We've gathered our family here tonight for a special announcement," Jeffrey began, looking at everyone but me. "As you know, this property has been in our family for years, but it hasn't reached its full potential. Our family. Not my family. Not my creation." The distinction was subtle but cutting. After careful consideration, he continued, "I've decided that the best thing for everyone is to transfer ownership of this villa to Thomas and Eleanor." The table erupted in applause and congratulations. Eleanor beamed while Thomas nodded as if accepting something that was rightfully his. I sat frozen, unable to process what I was hearing. "Dad has agreed that at his age, maintaining such a large property is becoming difficult," Jeffrey said, finally looking in my direction. "The Harringtons have the resources to preserve and improve it for future generations." I found my voice at last. "I've agreed to no such thing," I said, loud enough to cut through the celebratory chatter. The table fell silent again, faces turning to me with expressions ranging from surprise to annoyance. Jeffrey's smile became strained. "Dad, we've discussed this. The deed transfer papers are already prepared." "What deed transfer?" "I've signed nothing," I replied, my heart pounding. Thomas cleared his throat. Perhaps this isn't the appropriate venue for these details, Jeffrey. Your father might be confused about the arrangements. I'm not confused, I said, standing up. This is my home. I designed it. I built it. I own it. There has been no discussion about transferring ownership to anyone. Jeffrey's expression hardened. Actually, Dad, if you check your financial records, you'll find that you signed over power of attorney to me last year. It was among the estate planning documents we reviewed. A cold shock ran through me. I had signed several documents Jeffrey had presented as routine updates to my will and insurance policies. Had I missed something so critical? Had he slipped in something I hadn't read carefully? That's impossible, I said. I would never give anyone power of attorney over my affairs. Alicia sighed dramatically. This is exactly why the transfer is necessary. Quincy is becoming forgetful, possibly showing early signs of cognitive decline. The audacity of her statement left me speechless. I was in perfect health, both physically and mentally, and had just had a clean bill of health from my doctor 2 months prior. Using the power of attorney, Jeffrey continued as if I hadn't spoken. I've already initiated the transfer of the property deed to the Harringtons. It's a generous arrangement. They'll allow us to use the villa whenever we want, and they're planning significant improvements. Thomas raised his glass. To new beginnings and family legacies. Everyone drank except me. I looked around the table at these people who had invaded my home and were now celebrating its theft. My gaze finally landed on Jeffrey, my son, who couldn't quite meet my eyes. This is illegal, I said quietly. I never granted you power of attorney. Whatever document you're referring to must be fraudulent. The table fell silent again. Jeffrey's face flushed with anger. Don't make this difficult, Dad, he hissed. It's already done. The Harringtons are being incredibly generous. They're even offering to let you stay in the East Wing guest suite until you find a suitable retirement community. The full reality of the situation hit me like a physical blow. My son wasn't just trying to take my home, he was trying to put me in a nursing home and erase all evidence of my existence here. The room seemed to tilt slightly as a wave of dizziness passed over me. I think your father needs some time to adjust to the news, Eleanor said with false concern. Change is always difficult at his age. This conversation is over, I said, steadying myself against the table. I'm not signing anything, and I'm not going anywhere. This is my home, and you are all guests here, guests who have overstayed their welcome. Jeffrey stood up, his expression cold in a way I had never seen before. He pulled an envelope from his jacket and slid it across the table toward me. These are the legal documents showing the transfer of property. It's already filed with the county. And this, he added, placing another envelope beside the first, is a formal notice giving you 2 weeks to remove your personal belongings from the premises. I stared at the envelopes, unable to believe what was happening. You can't do this, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It's already done, Jeffrey replied. Then, in a tone that will haunt me forever, he added, This is theirs now. You are not allowed to come back after you leave. The physical pain I felt at that moment was indescribable, a crushing weight on my chest that made it difficult to breathe. My own son, my only child, the person I had devoted my life to raising and supporting, was betraying me in the most fundamental way possible. I looked at the expectant faces around the table, waiting for my capitulation, perhaps even enjoying my distress. In that moment, I made a decision. I would not give them the satisfaction of seeing me break down. I would not plead or argue further. Instead, I did something that clearly surprised them. I smiled and nodded. I see, I said calmly, rising from my chair. 2 weeks is sufficient time to make arrangements. If you'll excuse me, I have matters to attend to. I walked out of the dining room with as much dignity as I could muster, leaving behind a confused silence. In my bedroom, I locked the door and finally allowed the tears to come, muffling my sobs with a pillow so they wouldn't hear. The home I had created with love, the space that held my memories of Marlene, the legacy I had intended to pass on, all of it, was being stolen by the person I trusted most in the world. I spent that night alternating between grief and disbelief, poring over copies of documents I had signed over the past year, trying to understand how this could have happened legally. Somewhere in the pre-dawn hours, as I sat looking out at the lake Marlene and I had so loved, my sadness began to transform into something else: determination. I was not going to be a victim in this story. I was not going to quietly disappear into a retirement home while my son and his in-laws took everything I had built. If Jeffrey thought I would simply accept this betrayal, he had gravely underestimated the man who had raised him. The morning after the dinner party, I left the villa early, before any of the Harringtons were awake. I needed space to think clearly, away from their watchful eyes and false sympathy. I drove to a small coffee shop in town where I had been a regular for years. The owner, Frank, noticed my distress immediately. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Quincy," he said, bringing me a cup of black coffee. "Everything okay at the villa?" I found myself telling him the whole story: the gradual invasion, Jeffrey's betrayal, the apparent property transfer. Frank listened without interrupting, his expression growing increasingly concerned. "You need to talk to Martin," he said when I finished. "He's handled property disputes around the lake for 30 years. If anyone can help you, it's him." Martin Goldstein was a semi-retired real estate attorney who had helped me with the original purchase of the lakefront property. We had worked together on several projects over the years and developed a friendship based on mutual respect. I called him from the coffee shop, and he agreed to see me immediately. Martin's office was above the local hardware store, a modest space filled with legal texts and filing cabinets. He listened intently as I recounted the events of the past few months, taking detailed notes and occasionally asking for clarification. "First things first," he said when I finished. "Let me see every document you've signed in the past 2 years, especially anything Jeffrey prepared or presented to you." Over the next few hours, we combed through my financial and legal papers. Martin's expression grew increasingly troubled as we examined what appeared to be a power of attorney document with my signature. "This doesn't look right," he said, studying it under a magnifying glass. "The notary stamp is from New York, not New Hampshire. And the date this was supposedly signed, you were at a conference in Chicago." "I know, because we had lunch the day after you got back." A glimmer of hope sparked within me. "Are you saying it could be fraudulent?" Martin nodded slowly. "It's possible. We'll need to investigate further, but there are several irregularities here. What concerns me most is that they've already filed a property transfer with the county. We need to see those documents immediately." We drove to the county records office, where Martin's long-standing relationship with the staff helped us gain immediate access to the recently filed property documents. What we discovered was both shocking and encouraging. "They've made a critical mistake," Martin said, examining the transfer deed. "The document refers only to the structure, the villa itself, but not explicitly to the land it sits on." I was confused. "What does that mean?" "When you purchased the property," Martin explained, "you actually made 2 separate acquisitions. The first was the lakefront land, which you bought through a trust you established. The second was a construction permit for the villa, which was in your personal name. This deed only transfers ownership of the physical structure, not the land beneath it or around it." "How is that possible?" I asked. "Jeffrey would have needed access to both deeds to create this transfer." Martin's expression was grim. Either he didn't know about the land being in a separate trust, or he couldn't access those documents. Either way, they've only got half of what they think they have. They own a building, but not the 7 acres it sits on, or the lakefront access that makes the property valuable. For the first time since the dinner party, I felt a surge of something like hope. So legally, where does that leave us? "In a strong position to contest this entire transfer," Martin said, "especially if we can prove the power of attorney was fraudulently obtained, but we need to move carefully. If Jeffrey realizes the mistake, he might try to correct it before we can take action." Over the next week, I embarked on a careful campaign of documentation and evidence gathering. During the day, I appeared to be complying with the eviction notice, packing boxes and making arrangements, as if I intended to leave quietly. But each night, I worked with Martin on building our case. We discovered that Thomas Harrington had already applied for permits to extensively renovate the villa, permits that would violate several conservation easements that protected the lakefront property. This suggested they were planning to commercialize the property, possibly turning it into luxury vacation rentals or a private club, a use explicitly forbidden by local zoning laws. I reached out to neighbors who had witnessed the Harringtons' gradual takeover of my home. Several provided written statements describing how they had observed my increasing isolation and the strange parade of visitors who behaved as if they owned the place. My longtime groundskeeper, Eduardo, provided particularly valuable testimony about overhearing Thomas and Scott discussing plans to demolish the old man's workshop as soon as they got him out. Martin suggested we contact the original notary, whose stamp appeared on the power of attorney document. After several days of searching, we located her in Manhattan. When presented with a copy of the document, she confirmed our suspicions. She had never notarized any such paper and had been on maternity leave on the date in question. Her notary stamp had been reported stolen 6 months earlier. With this evidence in hand, Martin filed an emergency injunction to halt the property transfer pending investigation of potential fraud. The timing was crucial. We needed to act before the 2-week eviction period ended, but not so soon that Jeffrey and the Harringtons would have time to counter our legal maneuvers. The hardest part of this period was maintaining a calm facade around Jeffrey and the Harringtons. Each day, I would make a show of packing more of my belongings, sometimes asking for Jeffrey's input on what I should take or leave behind. These conversations were excruciating: his cold detachment, his casual dismissal of items that held deep sentimental value for me. "You don't need all these books, Dad," he said, gesturing to my library collection. "The retirement community won't have space for them." "Perhaps you're right," I would reply, hiding my pain. "I'll just take a few favorites." Meanwhile, I was secretly documenting everything in the villa that I had personally designed, built, or paid for. Martin advised creating a comprehensive inventory with receipts, photographs, and witness statements where possible. This would be crucial for establishing my ownership rights if the case went to court. One evening, as I was photographing custom cabinetry in the kitchen, Eleanor walked in unexpectedly. I quickly pretended to be taking one last picture for sentimental reasons. "It's good that you're accepting the situation," she said with transparent insincerity. "Change can be positive at your age. The retirement community has bridge nights on Tuesdays. You'll make new friends." I smiled vaguely and nodded, fighting the urge to tell her what Martin and I had discovered. The temporary restraining order had been granted that morning, but the Harringtons hadn't yet been served with the papers. That would happen strategically, on the day they planned to take full possession. As the 2-week deadline approached, the Harringtons became increasingly comfortable with their perceived victory. They scheduled contractors to begin renovations the day after I was supposed to leave. Thomas had architectural plans drawn up that would essentially gut the interior of the villa, removing all the custom features I had so carefully designed. Furniture deliveries were arranged, and Eleanor was planning a large housewarming party to show off their new acquisition to their social circle. The night before the eviction deadline, Jeffrey came to the small guest room where I had been sleeping since they took over the master bedroom. He seemed uncomfortable, perhaps experiencing a flicker of conscience about what he was doing. "I've found a nice assisted living place in Concord," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "They have an opening next week. I've already put down a deposit." "That's very thoughtful," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. He hesitated, then added, "This is for the best, Dad. You can't manage this place anymore. The Harringtons have the resources to maintain it properly." I looked at my son, searching for any sign of the boy I had raised, the young man who had once stood beside me admiring the sunset from the deck I had built with my own hands. "I have just one question, Jeffrey," I said quietly. "Why? Was it the money? The status of being connected to Alicia's family? What made you willing to betray your own father?" He flushed, anger replacing discomfort. "It's not betrayal, it's practical. You're getting older. This place is too much for you. And yes, the Harringtons can do things for my career, for our future, that you never could. Sometimes you have to make tough decisions for the greater good." The greater good. As if stealing my home, my memories, my legacy was somehow a noble act. In that moment, I realized that regardless of the outcome of our legal battle, I had already lost my son. The person standing before me was a stranger wearing Jeffrey's face. "I see," I said simply. "Good night, Jeffrey." After he left, I sent a text message to Martin confirming our plan for the next day. Everything was in place. The Harringtons believed they had won, that I would quietly disappear from their lives, leaving them to enjoy the fruits of their scheme. They had no idea what awaited them on moving day. As I looked around the small guest room, at the few possessions I had kept accessible rather than packing away, I felt a strange sense of calm. Tomorrow would bring either justice or a new chapter in my life. Either way, I would face it on my terms, not theirs. I fell asleep that night thinking of Marlene, wondering what she would say about all this. Somehow, I felt certain she would approve of what I was about to do. Moving day dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect summer morning that had made me fall in love with the lakefront property all those years ago. From my window, I could see a line of vehicles already arriving, the Harringtons' luxury cars, a moving truck, and vans belonging to various contractors. They were wasting no time in taking possession and beginning their renovations. I dressed carefully in my best suit, the one I reserved for special occasions. Today would certainly qualify. When I emerged from the guest room with my suitcase, Jeffrey looked surprised. "You're up early," he said. "The assisted living place isn't expecting you until tomorrow." "I thought I'd get an early start," I replied calmly. "There's a hotel in town where I can stay tonight." Jeffrey seemed relieved, likely grateful that I wasn't going to create a scene in front of his in-laws. He had no idea what I had planned. Outside, the activity was reaching a fever pitch. Workers were unloading furniture from the moving truck, expensive pieces that would replace my carefully chosen items. A landscape crew was marking areas of the garden for redesign, including the special corner that held Marlene's memorial planting. Thomas was directing everything like a general, pointing and instructing with authoritative gestures. Eleanor spotted me and approached with a practiced smile. "Quincy, good morning. I'm glad to see you're ready to go." Jeffrey mentioned there might be some resistance. "No resistance," I assured her. "Though I would like to say a proper goodbye to everyone before I leave. Perhaps we could all gather on the front lawn in about 20 minutes. A little farewell ceremony." She seemed suspicious but nodded. "I suppose that would be appropriate. I'll let everyone know." As Eleanor walked away to spread the word, I texted Martin, "They're all here. Time to proceed." Exactly 20 minutes later, as the Harringtons and their entourage of workers assembled on the front lawn, expecting some sort of pathetic farewell speech, 3 vehicles pulled into the long driveway. Martin emerged from the first, accompanied by a court officer. From the second came Eduardo and 2 other longtime employees of mine who had witnessed the Harringtons' gradual takeover. The third vehicle contained Regina Diaz, the county property commissioner, and her assistant. The expressions on the Harringtons' faces shifted from confusion to alarm as Martin approached, legal documents in hand. "Good morning," he said pleasantly. "I'm Martin Goldstein, attorney for Quincy Williams. Officer Jenkins here has some papers to serve to Jeffrey Williams, Thomas Harrington, and Eleanor Harrington." "What is this?" Thomas demanded, his face reddening. "We have no business with you." "On the contrary," Martin replied, "you have significant business with us. Officer Jenkins is serving you with a temporary restraining order preventing any further action regarding this property, pending investigation of fraudulent property transfer and elder abuse charges." A stunned silence fell over the gathering. Jeffrey's face had gone pale, while Alicia looked frantically between her husband and her parents. Commissioner Diaz stepped forward. "Additionally, my office has reviewed the property records and confirmed that the recent deed transfer filed with the county only pertains to the physical structure, not the land it sits on. The land remains solely owned by the Quincy Williams Living Trust, which cannot be transferred via power of attorney." "That's a technicality," Thomas blustered. "We have legal ownership of the house." "Actually," Martin interjected, "you have attempted ownership based on a fraudulent power of attorney document." The notary whose stamp appears on that document has signed an affidavit confirming she never authorized or stamped such a document. In fact, she was on maternity leave on the date in question, and her stamp had been reported stolen. Jeffrey stepped forward, his expression a mixture of anger and fear. "Dad, what are you doing?" "We had an agreement." "We had no such agreement," I replied, my voice steady despite my racing heart. "You attempted to steal my home through fraud and manipulation. Did you really think I would just accept that?" The workers and contractors were now looking uncomfortable, sensing they had been brought into a legal dispute. Several began quietly packing up their tools. "This is ridiculous," Alicia snapped. "Jeffrey has power of attorney. He has every right to make decisions about his father's property." Martin smiled thinly. "The power of attorney document in question has been flagged as potentially fraudulent. Furthermore, even a legitimate power of attorney doesn't grant the right to self-deal or to dispose of the principal's property for personal gain. If this goes to court, Jeffrey could face criminal charges for elder exploitation." The word criminal hung in the air. I could see the moment it hit Jeffrey the realization that this wasn't just about losing a property, but potentially facing prosecution. His expression crumbled. "Dad," he said, his voice suddenly pleading, "we can work this out. It was all a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" I repeated, feeling a surge of righteous anger. "You told me to my face that my home now belonged to the Harringtons. You served me with eviction papers. You tried to send me to an assisted living facility while you and your in-laws took over the home I designed and built. Which part of that was a misunderstanding?" Thomas tried to regain control of the situation. "This is a family matter that's gotten out of hand. Surely we can resolve this privately, without all this legal nonsense." Commissioner Diaz shook her head. "Mr. Harrington, this is now a matter of public record. My office has already flagged the property transfer as suspicious and potentially fraudulent. Additionally, we've discovered that your renovation plans violate multiple lakefront conservation easements and zoning restrictions." Eleanor turned on Thomas, her carefully maintained composure cracking. "You said this was all taken care of. You promised me this property was legally ours." As the Harringtons began arguing amongst themselves, Martin guided me a few steps away. "You don't have to stay for this," he said quietly. "The restraining order prevents them from making any changes to the property or removing you from it. You can go back inside your home now." I looked at the villa, the home I had created with love and dedication, and then at the group of people who had tried to take it from me. Jeffrey stood apart from the arguing Harringtons, looking lost and devastated. Despite everything, a part of me ached for my son, for what he had thrown away. "I need to finish this," I told Martin. I walked back to the center of the group. The arguing stopped as they noticed my approach. "I want all of you off my property within the hour," I said, my voice clear and firm. "Take your personal belongings and leave. Anything remaining will be considered abandoned and disposed of." "You can't do this," Alicia protested. "We have rights." "Actually, you don't," Martin replied from behind me. "The restraining order is quite clear. Until this matter is resolved legally, no one named in the order may enter or occupy the property without Mr. Williams' explicite permission." Thomas looked like he might argue further, but Eleanor grabbed his arm, whispering urgently in his ear. After a moment, he nodded stiffly. "Fine," he said. "We'll leave for now. But this isn't over, Williams." "On the contrary," I replied, "it is very much over." As the Harringtons began the humiliating process of packing their vehicles under the watchful eyes of the court officer, Jeffrey approached me one last time. "Dad," he began, his voice breaking slightly, "I never meant for it to go this far. Alicia and her parents, they convinced me it was the right thing to do, that you'd be better off in a place where you could be cared for." I looked at my son, the boy I had raised, the man who had betrayed me so completely. "You were willing to commit fraud to steal my home," I said quietly. "You were willing to erase everything your mother and I built together. For what? To impress your in-laws? To gain access to their money and connections?" Tears filled his eyes. I made a terrible mistake. Can you ever forgive me? The question hung between us, heavy with implications. Could I forgive this level of betrayal? Should I? I don't know, Jeffrey, I answered honestly. What I do know is that trust, once broken, is not easily repaired. You'll need to find your own way forward now. Without access to my home or my resources, he nodded slowly, accepting the justice of my words. What will you do now? I gazed at the villa, my creation, my sanctuary. I'm going to reclaim my home. After that, we'll see. Jeffrey turned away, walking toward where Alicia waited by their car, her expression thunderous. I watched them drive away, feeling a complex mixture of grief, anger, vindication, and relief. Martin came to stand beside me as the last of the Harringtons' vehicles disappeared down the driveway. Congratulations, he said. You've won the first battle. There will be more legal proceedings ahead, but with the evidence we've gathered, I'm confident we'll prevail. I nodded, too emotionally drained to fully celebrate. Thank you, Martin. I couldn't have done this without you. As we walked back toward the villa, my villa, I felt the weight of the past months beginning to lift. I had been betrayed by those I should have been able to trust most, but I had not been defeated. I had fought back and reclaimed what was rightfully mine. The road ahead would not be easy. There would be legal battles, painful confrontations, and difficult decisions to make about my relationship with Jeffrey. But for now, I had won. I could sleep in my own bed tonight, surrounded by the memories and creations that defined my life's work. As I stepped through the front door, I whispered, "We did it, Marlene. We protected our home." The legal aftermath of what became known locally as the villa incident stretched on for nearly a year. True to his word, Martin pursued the case vigorously, compiling irrefutable evidence of the fraudulent power of attorney and the calculated attempt to steal my property. The notary, whose stamp had been misused, provided crucial testimony, as did several of the contractors who had overheard the Harringtons discussing their plans to completely overhaul the property once they got rid of the old man. Jeffrey and the Harringtons attempted to countersue, claiming I had verbally agreed to the transfer, but their case fell apart under scrutiny. The discovery process revealed emails between Jeffrey and Thomas discussing how to accelerate the transition and manage Quincy's expectations euphemisms for their scheme to push me out of my own home. The most damning evidence came from Jeffrey's own computer, a draft document he had created outlining a strategic acquisition plan for the villa, including a timeline for my removal and detailed renovation plans that would have erased every trace of my and Marlene's presence there. When confronted with this evidence during a deposition, Jeffrey finally broke down and admitted the truth. The Harringtons had targeted my property shortly after Jeffrey and Alicia began dating, recognizing its value and potential. They had systematically worked to isolate me, make me doubt my own judgment, and ultimately force me out through a combination of legal manipulation and psychological pressure. The court ruled decisively in my favor, invalidating the fraudulent property transfer and issuing a permanent injunction preventing Jeffrey or any of the Harringtons from entering my property without explicit written permission. Additionally, they were ordered to pay substantial damages for the emotional distress and attempted elder abuse. Throughout this process, I received an unexpected outpouring of support from the community. Neighbors I had known for years brought meals, offered companionship, and shared their own stories of family conflicts over property and inheritance. Frank from the coffee shop organized a welcome home gathering once the legal battle was officially won. These gestures of kindness helped heal some of the deep wounds left by my son's betrayal. Alicia filed for divorce from Jeffrey 6 months after the failed property scheme, moving back to her parents' home in the Hamptons and taking much of their joint assets with her. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she had already become engaged to a wealthy real estate developer with properties throughout the Northeast. Jeffrey's life unraveled quickly after that. The fraud allegations damaged his professional reputation, and he eventually lost his position at the financial firm. He moved to a small apartment in Boston and, according to occasional updates from former colleagues, was trying to rebuild his life from scratch. I struggled with my feelings toward my son. The anger and hurt remained profound, but so did the memories of the little boy who had once followed me around construction sites, asking questions about load-bearing walls and proper insulation techniques. The young man who had sat beside his mother during her illness, reading to her for hours when she was too weak to hold a book herself. As for me, I made significant changes in the aftermath of the betrayal. While I retained ownership of the villa, I found I no longer wanted to live there full-time. Too many painful memories now mingled with the good ones. Instead, I purchased a smaller, more manageable house in a nearby town, a cozy 2-bedroom cottage with a workshop where I could pursue my woodworking projects. The villa I transformed into something new. Working with a non-profit organization that provided retreats for veterans suffering from PTSD, I donated the use of the property for therapeutic programs. The peaceful lakeside setting proved ideal for healing wounded spirits, and I found profound satisfaction in seeing the space filled with people who truly appreciated its beauty and tranquility. I also became involved with a local elder justice coalition, sharing my experience to help others recognize the warning signs of exploitation and emotional manipulation. The knowledge that my painful story might help protect others from similar betrayals gave meaning to what I had endured. 8 months after the court ruling, I received a letter from Jeffrey. He wrote of his regret and shame, of the therapy he had been undergoing to understand why he had been so easily influenced by the Harringtons, so willing to betray his own father for status and connection to wealth. He asked for nothing. Not forgiveness, not money, not a relationship, just the chance to express his remorse. After much consideration, I agreed to meet him at a neutral location, a park halfway between my new home and his apartment. The meeting was awkward and painful, with long silences and carefully chosen words. Jeffrey looked older, thinner, his confident demeanor replaced by hesitant gestures and downcast eyes. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said as we sat on a bench overlooking a small pond. "What I did was unforgivable." "Why did you do it?" I asked, the question that had haunted me for months. He was quiet for a long moment. "I wanted to belong to their world," he finally said. "The Harringtons made everything seem so easy. Money, connections, opportunities. They made me feel that if I did this one thing for them, I would be set for life. They convinced me you would be better off, that the villa was too much for you to handle." He looked up, meeting my eyes for the first time. "But that was just the excuse. The truth is, I was greedy and weak. I betrayed everything you and Mom taught me about integrity and family." His honesty, painful as it was to hear, opened a small door within me. Not to forgiveness, not yet, but to the possibility that someday we might find a way forward. "I'm not ready to have you in my life again," I told him. "Trust, once broken, is not easily rebuilt. But I'm willing to accept that people can change, that mistakes, even terrible ones, don't have to define us forever." We agreed to occasional communication letters, primarily, with the potential for more direct contact in the future if things progressed positively. It was a small beginning, but perhaps all that was possible given what had transpired. As the months passed, I found a new rhythm to my life. The smaller house suited me well, and I developed friendships with neighbors who appreciated my architectural insights and woodworking skills. I began teaching a class at the local community college, sharing my knowledge with a new generation of designers and builders. The villa continued its transformation into a healing space for veterans, and I visited regularly to maintain the gardens and ensure the property remained in good condition. During one such visit, as I sat on the dock watching the sunset over the lake, I felt Marlene's presence more strongly than I had in years. "We built something beautiful here," I said aloud, as if she could hear me. "And even though it didn't turn out as we planned, it's still doing good in the world." The journey from betrayal to this moment of peace had been long and painful. I had lost my son's love and trust, but I had gained a deeper understanding of my own resilience and strength. I had been knocked down but not defeated. I had rebuilt not just my living situation, but my sense of purpose and community. The hardest lesson I learned was that sometimes those closest to us can cause the deepest wounds. Jeffrey's betrayal cut so deeply precisely because I had loved and trusted him so completely. But I also learned that betrayal doesn't have to be the end of the story. We can choose how we respond to it, whether we allow it to embitter us or motivate us to create something new and meaningful from the pieces of our broken expectations. I chose to move forward with hope rather than hatred, to build rather than destroy. It wasn't easy, and there were days when anger still overwhelmed me. But gradually, the sharp edges of pain dulled, and I found myself able to look toward the future with curiosity rather than dread. If my story has any wisdom to offer, it's this: true strength isn't found in never being knocked down, but in how we rise afterward. True wealth isn't measured in property or possessions, but in the integrity with which we live our lives. And true family isn't always defined by blood, but by those who stand beside us in our darkest moments, helping us find our way back to the light. I would never have chosen this path of betrayal and loss. But having walked it, I can say with certainty that it has taught me more about myself, about resilience, and about what truly matters than all my years of success ever did. Sometimes, life's most valuable lessons come wrapped in its most painful packages. As I watch the sun sink below the horizon, painting the lake in shades of gold and crimson, I feel a sense of peace that once seemed impossible. My story isn't over. It simply entered a new chapter, one I'm writing on my own terms. I wonder, have you ever experienced betrayal by someone you trusted completely? How did you rebuild your life afterward? Share your stories in the comments below. If this account of my journey has touched you in some way, please consider liking and subscribing to hear more stories of resilience and renewal. And remember, no matter how dark things seem, there is always a path forward if you have the courage to take that first step. Thank you for listening to my story, and may you find strength for whatever challenges life brings your way.